আচ্ছা ইন্ট্রোডাকশন হবে স্ক্রিন সুইচ I guess. Who's calling? Okay, right. Sorry. So, okay, we're live, right? Yes. So, welcome to the second debate between Team India and Team Bangladesh. Representing Bangladesh as PM, we have Warish. As DPM, we have Zubair. And as the Gov Whip, we have Sajid. And representing India, as LO, we have Kartik. As DLO, we have Hemant. And as Op Whip, we will be having DJ or Dhananjay. On the motion that this House supports the international boycott of the Rio Olympics, I invite the Prime Minister to present a positive statement. Yes, sir. Hi, am I audible?
A country should only be able to bid for the Olympics if they are capable, if they don't have people in their streets dying every day, if there aren't people in that state living next to a skyscraper where they're forced to live in a favela on less than $2.50 a day. We say from our side on Team Bangladesh that countries should only bid for the Olympics if they're capable, if they don't have institutional corruption, the people of that country overwhelmingly want it, and that Olympics should not be a means to harm the vulnerable people in that state. And finally, why this should be a way to end the complicity of the committee in abusing its power. We have 4 arguments for you today. First, why is it principally justified because inaction is immoral? Second, why this will change the standards of the Olympics itself? Third, why we will reform the committee and why this is the best way to do so. And Dubai will come up and tell you about how it gives you an effective international pressure. First, let's move on to what exactly is happening and why there's a need for this policy to occur. Understand that Brazil is a country of extreme poverty and of extreme wealth inequality. The poor in that state have no means of rising out and of improving their situation because they're intensely politically marginalized. They live next to skyscrapers in slums in absolutely squalid conditions. Why is it specific to the Rio Olympics in the first place? Because understand that the infrastructure needed for that to occur, the hotels, the stadiums, those are built by displacing and demolishing the favelas into which these poor people live. This is built by removing them from the state and making them homeless and shoving them directly onto the street. And then even when they go onto the street, they're further shoved away into even more remote areas to keep them away from the eyes of tourists, to hide the problem of the intense systematic poverty that exists in that country. Third, very little of the Olympics revenue, whether it's through tickets or merchandise or otherwise, actually goes to Brazil themselves. This is because of the contract terms that they sign with the Olympic Committee. Most of the profit and most of the revenue goes to the foreign firms and to the committee and not to the country of Brazil itself. Fourth, even less of that money goes to the poor in that country, the people who desperately need it the most. The income directly goes to the foreign construction firms. It because of institutionalized corruption in that country where giving bribes is nothing more than shaking a hand, because at least most of that money goes to bribing those officials and to other means. Finally, what have we learned from the history of the World Cup? We have seen that when there was an urgent need for Brazil to invest in infrastructure such as health, such as security, rather they built stadiums. These stadiums are now an unused financial burden that are at best serving as a parking lot for trucks to live on a day in and day out basis. We believe that this is an intense harm to the people of that state who deserve a chance for a better life. Before I move on, PY.
Would you also boycott the Qatar and Russian World Cups?
Yes, it's absolutely in line with our principles because, as we tell you in our goal, this is an immoral thing to not do.
Yeah.
First, why is it principally justified? Because understand that the Olympics, the context of the argument is the Olympics is more than just a sporting event. This is the world's premier event where people from all around the world do come together into one state and show a sort of unity. What does this mean? This means on a secondary level, this event brings the masses together, and it's intensely important to people because it's important to their way of life and how the industry value and identify with the Olympics, and more than just a basic sporting event. Specifically in Brazil, these are people who are particularly well known for their sports fanaticism. These are people who are well known across the world for their love of the game and for love of the sport. What do we mean by this? This means that supporting the Olympics means approving of the circumstances and the process that led up to the event happening in the first place. This means that all the demolishing of favelas. This means all the systematic marginalization of the poor and the needy in those cities. This means the denying of those people the basic that they deserve. These are things that you do support, and these are things that you do condone and do allow when you allow this event to happen. This means that you're directly creating the reason for one more child to be displaced from their home and shoved onto the street. Even though the people who watch these are perfectly aware. They are perfectly aware because they do have some sense of sense, and they read the news and they see the protests happening in that country. This simply doesn't happen because supporting them is immoral. Why is this so important to this debate? Because this shows us a principled reason, despite any of the consequences, why we have a right for the international community to happen in this case. Well, next we move on to why the international community themselves are the best actor. Because understand that what we have tried so far is simple soft pressure, or simple statements of condemnation. They haven't worked. They haven't worked because in these cases, they simply ignore them and move on. It doesn't create a forceful incentive. Why is the international community in a unique position to help? Because they have a huge bargaining chip. If many countries at once do boycott, it means Olympics can't even occur. The athletes for that to occur don't go. Sponsors required for that to occur don't go. The audience required for that to occur don't go. This is why they're in an intensely unique position to help do so, and this is why it's the duty of the international community, regardless of consequences, to do so. Next, why this will change the standards of the Olympics. This is because we have tried other methods of pressure investigation, but they failed. Their internal methods don't work themselves because we're too afraid of removing a bid once we are there. This is a trend that has to change. We have seen the harms of the effect when the Qatar World Cup is perfectly ready to go on because we're afraid of putting it back because it means admitting a fault that we made. Why is this going to be effective? One, because it sends a unified message that isn't diluted, that has many countries behind it, and can't just be dismissed as an individual grudge of US or Venezuela against Brazil. Second, this means the governments who now want to bid know that the community can withdraw, and this is something that they're very likely to and willing to do, and that the community is capable of enforcing standards upon those countries. It creates a deterrence effect from those bad policies, the policies that systematically harm and marginalize the poor in those countries. Third, there's an intense fear of the elite in Brazil to lose the economic profit that they gain to make. This means that they have a huge incentive to protect their bottom line to make sure that this event does occur. Fourth, this means that the main reason that this goes forward to occur is because they want to improve their public image and to give their regime some degree of legitimacy. This fails completely. Because in that world, they don't get to have that legitimacy. That boycott highlights their corruption. They'll be remembered for years and years for being too corrupt to even hold a World Cup in the face. It worsens their image in this case, and this means on a long-term basis, on the final layer, this means when the next time Brazil tries to bid, they will want a lot for the Olympics to take place because it means so much to them. Because this means there'll be an intense comparison between the next World Olympics that they want to hold and the one with this one. There'll be an intense comparison that results in basis of why those people would be willing to make that choice. Before that, move on to POI.
When Brazil bid for the Olympics, it met all the criteria. You said it was a prospering democracy. Please defend taking away the Olympics now.
Sorry.
I said when Brazil bid for the Olympics, it met all the criteria that you said. That being
fine. We're willing to make new criteria that put these sort of ethical statements on these people for this to happen. Finally, what we have shown you from our side. We've shown you from our side that this is the only way you can have a proper sort of system through which you make the competency in this case, where you make a change in the community as a whole. We tell you that in this case, this is what under our world, the sort of world that we want for this to occur is one where we're willing to accept a trade-off. We're willing to accept in the fact that this may, in the short term, hurt some people in the short term on their job basis. Why are we willing with this? Why are we willing to make this trade-off for the more long-term solution that we provide? Under our world, we show you why. Because these people would have suffered in that case in the first place. These are people who are already in a systematic marginalization and they're already in a very bad situation to begin with. And finally, we tell you that just because you are not willing to suffer this short-term harm, in this case, you allow and doom these people to a lifetime of suffering. You doom the next generation to a lifetime of suffering because you're unwilling to take the hard first step of allowing these people to have a better life. That's why we're very proud from Team Bangladesh to propose. Thank you.
So moving on towards the opposition, and I invite the leader of the opposition, Karthik, to present the negatives. Here.
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 Yeah.
Can you hear them?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Panel, there is a fundamental and insidious problem in sports today. The problem is not Rio, it is not Brazil. The problem is the unaccountable, sovereignty-violating, rights-trampling and coercive institutions in sport, like the International Olympics Committee. These institutions are able to shift blame onto countries and ignore the fact that a boycott of Rio is going to make the conditions of the worst off people in Brazil even worse. That's why we think it's illegitimate to place the burden of international political failures on Brazil. We have to prove to you to win this debate that firstly, it's illegitimate to blame Brazil for Rio's problems and therefore illegitimate to boycott, or independently we can win by showing you why it significantly worsens the economic and political situation in Brazil. These are independent of each other. We can win if we prove either of them. It is not our burden to defend human rights violations in Brazil. Clearly, those are not things we should defend. They need to defend showing how this structurally improves the conditions in Brazil. I will tell you how it's unfair to punish Brazil for all the problems of Rio and why a boycott significantly worsens the conditions of Brazilian people. While Hemant will tell you about the effect on sports person. What do we support? We support structural reforms in the bidding process and in the International Olympic Committee to make it more representative and less coercive on countries. We think it's unfair for international into an economic crisis and then place double jeopardy of a boycott on them. Before I move on to my arguments, some points of rebuttal. In their framing, they said that a country should only bid for the Olympics It was a prospering democracy. It was one of the fastest growing nations in the world. Its human rights conditions were absolutely unknown, contrary to what the Prime Minister thinks, and it was one of the perfect nations to host it under their own criteria. We don't think they set any clear criteria for a boycott. We challenge the Deputy Prime Minister to come and tell us what exactly about Brazil they want to boycott. We're also unclear on what they mean specifically by a boycott. Do they mean that sponsors will withdraw? Do they mean foreign media will not cover? DPM again needs to come and tell us this, because if they don't actually defend those things, it's a contradiction of their principle. I'll move on to my principled argument, before that a point of information.
Do you not think it's Brazil's fault to not predict where its country would be at the point of time when it holds, when it made that bid itself?
So the day you can predict the country's economic future 15 years down the line, I'll make you chief economist of the country, and but to this day there's no person who can do that. All right, on to my principal argument as to why it's unfair to blame the problems of Rio on Brazil. This matters because in a boycott, it's true that Brazil has taken some bad decisions, but many and most of the problems in Brazil are not the fault of Brazil's decisions. Firstly, the Zika virus, for example, like the epidemic cannot reasonably be blamed on the country because of infrastructural factors that they can't control. But more importantly, let's look at the responsibility of the International Olympic Committee in the situation that we see today. As soon as Brazil has invested in all the infrastructure, bankrupted themselves literally to meet all the deadlines and the requirements of the international community, who always comes and checks the stadium construction deadline instead of checking the conditions of labor who are working on the construction, and if those stadiums aren't being built in time, they can impose heavy punitive fines on Brazil's government. We think this is clearly coercive and unfair. We furthermore think that it's unfair for the International Olympic Committee to ignore all factors of the country when they're bidding for a right to host the Olympics. They don't care about the human rights situation. They don't care about the labor situation. They don't care about the environment. We think the fact that they systematically award the right to host the Olympics to all these countries is a failure of the IOC itself. What did we hear from them on the principle? We heard that inaction is immoral. Exactly. We think that not taking action to stop the International Olympic Committee from actually exploiting Brazil and other countries like that in the long term is immoral. That's why we support on our side attacking the problem at its root, that is the International Olympic Committee, and not simply at its symptom, that is Brazil. They talked about how they want to have, they can see that most of the revenue goes to the International Olympic Committee, but somehow didn't draw the next logical link to show that the IOC is the one to be blamed. Because the fact is the principle is clearly on our side. And it's hugely unfair to penalize Brazil for this. But even if you aren't convinced by the principle, let's look at the practical aspects of this debate. My second argument as to why the boycott will significantly worsen the situation in Brazil. But before that, I'll take a point of information.
These structural reforms you so want to make, but don't actually elaborate on how you would do so. The only time that Sepp Blatter, the corrupt president of FIFA, was kicked from power is when there was a threatening to boycott the Qatar World Cup.
We think there are many other ways. Like if you think that the way to reform the International Olympic Committee is to impose huge economic damages on the people of Brazil, that's not a means we support. We think there are several other mechanisms to reform the International Olympic Committee, such as the countries that take part in the Olympics saying that we don't support this kind of mechanism anymore, particularly Western countries that have more power. We think that it's much better than simply saying that we should punish the people of Brazil in order to reform the International Olympic Committee. We don't think that follows. Second argument as to why the boycott worsens the situation in Brazil. This matters because we made a contract with Brazil. They did everything that we asked, and it's all over now. The question now is on the comparative. On which side will we see a better future in Brazil? We will show you with this argument that they significantly worsen the condition of Brazil and thus that they cannot win this debate. There are two main harms to Brazil. Firstly, economic, and secondly, political. On the economic harms that they cause when they conduct a boycott, let's look at the huge cost in terms of tourism, right? When the fact is that there's a huge number of Rio hotels that will simply not have any customers because there's nobody coming to watch the Rio Olympics. When the people who are setting up local shops around the stadiums will not get the chance to sell anything, we think that's a huge boost to the local economy that they don't have on their side. Secondly, there are things like it tarnishes the international investor image of Brazil. Given that there's a boycott of the country going on, clearly Brazil is never going to get the kind of investor image that allows it to make structural reforms and develop better infrastructure and have a better economy in the long term on their side. And listen to what they said about the economic benefits. The only benefit that they claimed to have was deterrence. They committed a mistake they should have known better than to commit and did not show us any solvency. Everything that they talked about was simply on how it creates long-term change without ignoring completely the fact that long-term change needs to come from the IOC and not from Brazil. Secondly, as to the political consequences. In the status quo, people are already rioting over the Olympics. You have people complaining about the fact that the stadiums have been built and there's no benefit coming, and the government can only tell them the benefits are going to come when the Olympic happens. What happens when they find out that all those stadiums that have been built are not going to be used? All the money has been wasted and there will be no benefit at all to the local economy, no benefit, given that Rio literally bankrupted itself to build these stadiums. We think it's much more likely to show bigger and worse protests than there are now. May even stoke an internal political crisis, which Brazil will find incredibly hard to recover from, given its current situation. We think ultimately this is the fault of the international community if they choose to boycott it. Because there's a month left to Rio, the damage has already been done, and if we boycott now, we will damn Brazil to a future worse than they would have had if we didn't do this. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to oppose. We haven't made it up.
We have
No.
So moving back to the government side, and I invite the DPM Zubair to continue with the golf case. Here. check am I audible? In a country whose culture, society, and a lot of things hinge upon the sportsmanship mentality, we put together the best possible resistance that we can uphold against the exploitation of different people, against the exploitation of the people who probably work in these stadiums. Is the best resistance by boycotting these tournaments altogether. Why is that so? Because for many instances we've seen how Brazil has been able to ignore all those economic crises on the basic fact that they are still being able to host tournaments. We've seen that in the case of ruling elite class as well. So this sort of ruling elite class often compromise and legitimizes the government because of the fact that in spite of all that economic exploitation, they've still been able to host tournaments. And we put to that the moment in time that we essentially challenge and condemn these elite classes to begin with, we enforce a much better change on our side. How is that so? But before I move on, a few points of rebuttals, right? They claim that International Olympic Committee is shifting blame if this policy is passed. We need structural reforms. 2 points of rebuttals to that, right? Firstly, it's not Brazil's fault at all, right? Brazil has made this bid 8 years ago, but they have had also a reserve for this sort of for hosting this tournament. They also have failed to use that reserve to begin with. But secondly, it's not that International Olympic Committee is shifting blame altogether, right? We put it that they are taking a huge blame upon themselves as well. Why is that so? Because because they show that we have failed to assess a particular bid properly, and we have failed to give the responsibility of hosting this tournament to a country who would be effective and efficient to begin with. Therefore, it's a huge blame on their side as well that they have dismissed a historical tournament for one term to begin with. Then they claim that there will be huge and terrible ramifications as common people do. Understand this, that these sorts of ramifications are not being solved on your side as well, right? We have tried to come up with structural reforms, we have tried to condemn, and even at particular countries have imposed sanctions on Brazil to begin with. But all these reformations have failed. But in our world, we at least put up a resistance that forces these countries to come up with certain reforms within themselves. We put it that's essentially that's beneficial according to the constructives that we are going to bring up today. So why on our side do we have more national and international pressures to begin with? So understand the way Brazil operates as a country, right? Brazil contains a society with rich people and a government who often don't care about the poor people at all. Why is that so? Because understand the hinge that this country is based on the sportsman mentality, right? Olympic is that one tournament that Brazil's football team has never been able to win. Secondly, Olympic Committee, so therefore their ability to not host this tournament is a huge attack to the ego to begin with. Secondly, Olympic Committee, sportsman training programs, etc. don't operate within Brazil as well. Therefore, it to a great extent hurts their self-interest as well. But thirdly, international community has a lot more incentive to force Brazil government to change. Why is that so? Because firstly, all those countries who have been training their athletes for a long time see that all that training has gone in vain. Secondly, people who bought tickets in these stadiums, people who bought visas and plane fares to go to Brazil to attend Olympic has also faced a huge loss as well. Thirdly, these sorts of people then start questioning and demanding their government as for a form of compensation. Therefore, a lot more media talk shows, a lot more incentive for government to go to United Nations and ask for some form of compensation, to ask for some form of payback. So in our world, this sort of international resistance is a lot more consolidated. And before I move on, a POI.
You still have not provided us any clear criteria by which you would decide whether a country can host the Olympics or not. Please provide them now.
A country will be able to host an Olympic when firstly, it has every economic capability to host it. Secondly, it does not exploit workers the way Brazil does. Thirdly, it does not misuse the reserve the way Brazil does by simply not by simply exploiting the money that they probably help for hosting Olympic to begin with. And fourthly, they go against certain values such as upholding equality as in terms of labor rights and etc. So moving on, Brazil has been within this economic depression for a long time, right? But within this span of time, many countries have got over the economic dependence and ties with Brazil. Therefore, a lot of these countries have normalized with the fact that Brazil is exploitative in nature and Brazil is facing a lot of economic crisis. These sorts of countries, because they have got over these ties, don't have an incentive to force Brazil's government to come up with a change. But our policy is that one policy that makes these countries force Brazil government to ask for a change. Why is that so? Because this hurts those countries' self-interest as well. As we've already shown you, all those training programs, all those money that they have put into buying tickets goes in vain. But lastly, multinational companies such as those who sell merchandise abroad from Brazil are also facing a huge amount of loss. So all those companies who had been trying to sell jerseys and merchandise face huge amount of losses. Then furthermore, we put to that all those firms who provide ancillary services, such as providing food to people who are audience to these matters, are also facing losses. Furthermore, we think this point is important because these firms are often owned by people who are from the ruling elite class. Why? And that's exactly why we think that these sorts of firms, upon facing such a huge economic loss, will have a much more incentive to force the government to come up with a change. The problem with Brazil today is this. Not only is that these people within Brazil have normalized with the fact that the country is facing a huge economic crisis, but secondly, these sorts of ruling elite class are not facing any sort of attack to their self-interest, because these sorts of ruling elite class are immune to the economic crisis to begin with. There is nothing that they hurt. There is nothing that hurts their economic that hurts their economic foundation to begin with. But in our world, all those people within Brazil face an economic loss as well. But lastly, we put to the International Olympic Committee is a lot more responsible in our world, right? Why is that so? Because Brazil in itself has become one country that is hosting tournament to make money out of them, right? We put to you that Brazil, a country which has tried to uphold a lot of sportsmanship, has failed to uphold those values in terms of hosting this tournament as well. We put to you, all those values have to be reinforced in our world. Why is that so? Because the moment in time that we say that in spite of all this fair play that you try to uphold within that stadium, the fact that you're going against all those people whom you promised to give economic stability, whom you have promised to not cheat with these sorts of reserves, those sorts of people have to be compensated in your world as well. So what have we shown you today? We've shown you in our world there's a lot better consolidated international pressure. Secondly, we've shown you why people in Brazil have a lot more incentive to pressurize the government to come up with a change. And lastly, our principle still stays robust as to why we should not allow a government who cheats people, who exploits people, and does not uphold the reserve that they once had. We are very proud to propose. Moving back to the opposition side, I invite Hemant, the DLO, to continue with the negative case. Here.
Yeah.
Just a sec, there's a flight passing overhead. It's really loud.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Panel, it's quite bizarre how proposition has been approaching this debate. Out of the 16 minutes they had, they spent the first 8 minutes telling us what the problems in Brazil were, what kinds of drastic poverty existed. and then quite bizarrely spent the next 8 minutes telling us how they worsened these problems and therefore solved everything about the Olympics. We think the comparative that they absolutely missed in this debate was solvency. They had to show us why boycotts and why uniquely and only boycotts could improve the situation in Brazil and also how could improve the Olympic and international situation. The comparative in this debate is that the losses, the opportunity cost has already happened. Given this, in this context, when they tell you that stadiums are going to be wasted or that resources are being spent, they have to tell us, given that these resources have already been wasted, why do they improve it by depriving these individuals of their revenue, of their investor image, of their tourist spending, and of their sponsorship? This is the comparative they failed to do, and by the time they hopefully do this in government whip, it will be too late in the debate and they have lost, therefore. Before moving on to constructives, two major areas of the debate. First, there's pseudo principle. Firstly, under this, they tell you that inequality is on the rise. We agree, yes, Brazil is in a bad situation. But what they fail to understand is that this loss has already happened, therefore irrelevant. Secondly, they tell you that the money doesn't go to the poor when an Olympic or an international tournament happens. Once again, they miss the comparative of some money, in our worst case, going to these poor and no money going to the poor because they have a boycott, no major teams come, and therefore the tournament becomes a non-tournament. They have to tell us why things like selling trinkets or spending on hotel rooms or media coverage of these local shops isn't a generation of revenue that we can sacrifice, and how sacrificing this revenue actually helps Brazil. We think that's the comparative they miss again here. Third, they talk to you about media coverage. What they fail to understand is how media coverage shifts on their side when you have a boycott. For example, when Brock Turner raped a woman, rather than covering the victim story, they covered this sports person as a hero whose life was compromised. If a rapist is treated this way, imagine how the story is going to shift on their side. It becomes about the sports persons whose careers have been compromised, about the countries that are boycotting the sport tournament. It does not become about Brazil, but rather becomes about the boycott, and therefore any solvency whatsoever only happens on our side, and the media cannot just actually go there without boycotting Brazil, but can show visceral images like, for example, the poverty in the favelas of Brazil, well compared to on their side when the media doesn't go there at all. But secondly, negotiations. Now they made this random point on their second speech telling that we create some form of statement. Let's get to that later. But how do we create negotiations better? Because for negotiations, we need to prevent animosity. But when they tell you that they'll do the same thing for Qatar and Russia, we think it's ridiculous. It is a ridiculous way of attempting to improve human rights. Your way to tackle rogue nations or semi-rogue nations should not be to shut them down, isolate them, and deprive them of the opportunities you promised them and force them to work upon for so many years. But secondly, we think what, apart from this animosity, they do is to shift the blame from the Olympic community, from the failures of international community to these nations, and that is the compromise that they fail on once again. Moving on to what little outcomes they talk to you about. But before that, let's look at the concessions they made in the POIs. First, we asked them, will you do this for Qatar and Russia? They said yes. So proposition's policy at this point of time is that we will give bad nations or nations that are likely to fail some sporting tournaments. We will pressurize them to meet insane and unrealistic standards. When they have worked so hard and make so many costs and have to face such an opportunity cost, we'll tell them no, we will boycott you, we will hit your ego and cause emotional trauma for your people who love these sports so much. That is ridiculous. What we think we should rather do is the comparative that we place, that we should reform it and rather prevent allotting these sports tournaments in the first place, and that's what they failed to engage with this. But second, they tell you that they changed criteria. But the criteria that they listed was already status quo. But second, what are these? Why do you think nations can now predict differently their economic turmoil that could possibly happen in the future? But third, can countries change after meeting this criteria? But fourth, if these criteria are indeed this high that countries can't go beyond that level, that means only white Western nations get sporting tournaments, and the nations like Brazil that love sports don't get those sporting tournaments. But finally, we think what this means is that there is no pressure to change the IOC, and this becomes a cosmetic change. Finally, they tell you that apparently we normalize the ruling elite and entrench them. No, one, there is already protest against the elite in Brazil, but second, Dilma Rousseff just got kicked out of the parliament, and that's a lie. I'll take a few over.
Right. So in your world, the 2014 Brazil World Cup happened. You tried everything you talk about. People still lost their jobs. They still suffered from economic repercussions that were worse than before the World Cup. Tell me why anything would change.
Guys, we're not going back in time and debating this debate. We are debating this debate today where all of these losses have already happened. Therefore, this debate is about the best futuristic outcomes. You have failed to understand that and therefore lost. They tell us that we don't solve this problem. What did we have to show you? We needed to show you that on their side that it is worse off, which they conceded when they told you that revenue does reduce, the political crisis does increase. But then in their second speech, they quite well explained what the cost of denying them this opportunity are, and therefore what this means is that they worsen of the existing situation on their side, and therefore automatically have lost this debate. They failed to engage on how they exacerbate the crisis. Moving on to constructives. Why is it illegitimate for sports to be politicized? For them and for on their side to this international boycott to actually happen, it means that nations are now pressurized into this boycott. Under this context, why is it fundamentally illegitimate? One, the impact on sport teams. That is to say that sport teams have trained hard, have been invested so much, have been training for years. What this means is that the 4 years gap between this Olympics and the next Olympics, which possibly also they'll boycott, is the gap in which an athlete's career gets over, is the gap in which they become too old to have their best performance, and that is the opportunity cost of sporting teams that have fought so hard, that have trained so hard. They never justified why we should use athletes to get our narrow political agenda, especially when it's our fault that these political agenda even arise. I'll take a POI.
Right. So in your world, you're willing to sacrifice a tournament that harms significant numbers of people, displaces them from their homes in the name of protecting a few sports athletes and their careers.
Guys, all of these losses have already happened. Displacement, loss of revenue, loss of finances, they have happened. This debate is about the future. Please understand and at least do this in your government will. But moving on, the second harm that they do. We think that some teams are still going to go and that this international boycott isn't truly going to be international. Obviously, Brazil's allies and Latin American friends are still attending the Olympics. What this means is that this is unfair for certain sporting teams that are pressurized into not attending and to wasting their resources and training. But thirdly, when countries are pressurized to go, we think it's unfair on 3 levels. One, it's directly unfair because they can't prioritize their sport over international politics that they don't care about, like for example, nations that don't actively engage in the international community apart from the sport. But second, small nations like Jamaica that depend on the sport to get at least some international recognition are worse off on their side. But third, any sponsors that would have come into Brazil are lost. Finally, we think the investment that would have otherwise come into Brazil is wasted. We think people who actually love sport in Brazil, like they talk about, are have to face the emotional trauma of having these favorite tournaments being ripped away from them. It is illegitimate to place the burden of international political failures on Brazil and shift our blames. They have to engage. Proud voters.
So moving back towards the golf side again, and to conclude the constructive speeches, I invite the golf whip Sajid. In a world where people lose their homes, in a world where people are getting systematically oppressed and displaced, in a world where their rights as humans are not being represented, we from Team Government think it's absolutely abhorrent that Team Opposition argues on who to blame this thing on and treats this as an unrealistic standard that Olympic committees have to meet. We think it's just a normal standard that any international event holds certain basic human rights and certain basic forms of ideological citizenship rights in comparison to like huge rights given to them. These are basic rights, like the right to not get kicked out of your home, ladies and gentlemen, not really an unrealistic standard. We agree with a chunk of what the second speaker from the opposition says. This debate is about the future. The harms have already happened. We're going to specifically show to you why the harms already having happened is the best way to deal with trends in the future, not creating a trend of future Olympics that follow the same trend of making the same problem
happen again and again and again. We're going to argue on three contentions. First, is the government of Brazil principally at fault for causing the problem? Second, what changes future trends of events and how the incurring harm right now is worth it? But third, Brazil's future at large, something that the opposition wholeheartedly agrees on. But let's point something out, right? We highlighted a principle from our very first speech, that is individuals having a moral responsibility and duty to not funnel and support any event, no matter who is at fault for it. You directly financing it means that you support the displacement of those people. You support the oppression of those people. A rebuttal that has been lacking from team opposition and a principle that still stands today, ladies and gentlemen. If that principle continues to stand, we win this debate by virtue of that principle. But going into contentions. First, why the Brazilian people are at fault. We think an international event is not just an international committee holding an event, right? It's a huge cooperation that exists between both parties, i.e. that's how the bidding process works. You come in with a bid, you represent yourself to the international community, they assess you. Here's where we differ from team opposition. We don't say that the blame should solely go to Brazil. We say that the blame should go to all parties involved in the decision-making process. We have no problem with principally harming both Brazil and the international community, which we'll show to you in our later speech. But we don't think that the Brazilian government is completely devoid of fault, right? The fact that they bid 8 years on, had resources, said they had resources, but misused it. The fact that you systematically oppress people in the name of creating an event, something that you had the power to not do, but you still chose to do it, right? We don't see how they're not at fault in this. There's huge amounts of complicity that exists for the Brazilian government. But even so, the very fact that they couldn't hold off pressure from international, even if the international community is fault, the fact that the government could not hold off pressure is another reason why they should be blamed, ladies and gentlemen. We don't say how they're completely scot-free, ladies and gentlemen. But second, why this changes future trends of events. We'll talk about this specifically, but before that, Apio.
You principally agree with harming other actors involved, but on your side, what actually happens to any of the other actors involved?
Brings me very nicely to my second clash. What happens to each of these actors? First, Brazilian state and how it operates. The very fact that Brazil has the ability to cater to an event is dependent on its ability to fix its problems, right? We think, firstly, the very fact that you boycott an event that doesn't uphold standards means the Brazilian government is forced to change the situation within the country before hosting another international event. That's an internal deterrent and pressure that works on this government. Secondly, the government incurring huge economic harms that already exist that you clearly point out to is exactly why they realize the impact of that decision. The very fact that they incurred economic harms means they're more likely to not do it in the future. Third, we're talking about things like huge global scrutiny. The Brazilian image being harmed, something you talk about, is a good thing, right? Because it forces the Brazilian government to change, to work towards people, something that you in the status quo don't really solve. Why? You did the same thing with the World Cup in 2014, something that Brazil, by the way, not back in history 2 years ago, did. Why do you still fail? Because all other mechanisms didn't work. You failed because you're afraid of taking a bid back. You're afraid of what it means to change how the global event system works. One change, ladies and gentlemen, is what we need to instigate the process of change within the country. But secondly, the ones you want to punish, Olympic committee, we're more than happy to do so. But why are they better catered to in our world? What does the Olympic Committee depend on? One, garnering support from the international community. Two, the very fact that they have huge reputation of hosting international events, both catering to in our world, where we once showed you that the international community, something that you have your power based on, boycotts you. So your power is significantly weaker. But two, the very fact that these events, something you're good at hosting, fails is another reputational harm that you incur. So the International Committee of Olympics is forced to take better decisions. But even more so, things you completely shunned away. How other governments, because they boycott, have to explain things to their people. Like the fact that fans bought tickets, the fact that fans bought jerseys, those no longer exist. Those governments have to explain to those people why they got taken away. If you can't provide a reasonable explanation, you fail. So those people also understand the importance of Brazil, right? In your world, they just go to Brazil Brazil enjoy the Olympics, be fans, watch games, never really understand the problem of Brazil, never really pressurize the government to change the problem, something we cater to. But also huge sponsors pressurize, something you also didn't cater to. Ancillary businesses and what they mean to an international community. We think international event. We think in that situation, the fact that huge money is taken away and huge harms incurred also mean you're pressured. But lastly, Brazil's future and what this means. Two things they talked about. First, economic harm. Second, political harm. First, in terms of economic harm, we think the harms happen anyway, right? When you have this World Cup, one, the jobs that you provide are really short-term jobs, right? Not really a long-term sustainable future job. But secondly, after the World Cup happens, you systematically disenfranchise these people even more. We've seen this happen with Brazil post the World Cup. Those jobs got kicked out. Those people got shunned away from the main region of the country. Those stadiums that were built were used as infrastructure that were never utilized in the sports leagues, but were used as parking lots for people. So ultimately, that's another reason why, one, we attribute the blame to the Brazilian government, but two, the fact that economic harms happen in your world anyway. But why is the economic harm so worth it? The economic harm, ladies and gentlemen, is worth it because if you don't incur this, the trend of all future events being afraid of incurring an economic harm and continuing to oppress people continues. Because guys, what's the trade-off? Even assuming we harm Brazil, those are 10,000 people to 20,000 people harmed now. But we're stopping the hundreds of thousands of people that would have been otherwise oppressed in future international events, in future tournaments that are hosted by the Olympic Committee. Weigh out simple numbers here, 20,000 Brazilians, 100,000 future events and their people. But secondly, we think that the political harm is deserved, right? One, because you failed to produce a tournament that represents the people and how the people want it to be. You failed to mandate what the people want and you took on a tournament that in itself is bad for the people. But two, even if that political harm happens, it's another added layer of deterrence. So in conclusion, what has team government shown to you? One, we engaged on the idea of how it's principally justified to hold the Brazilian government to account, but we're not doing so. We're holding everyone to account. Two, the change of trends in future events is going to work because of the stakeholders we've analyzed. Three, Brazil's future is still not going to get any worse in your world, but it's worth it in our world. We save hundreds of thousands of people in the future. We're willing to change the trend of international events. We're willing to save people. We win this debate.
So now for the last constructive speech, I invite Dhananjay, the opposition whip, to conclude the case.
What side proposition has failed to understand is that all the problems they've stated have already happened. People have been displaced and they have been abused. The rich have made their money and they're unlikely to do so a little more, and the poor are the ones who are left to gain. I'll show you how. Bids have been given to wrong countries and they will hold these sporting events in the future. It is apparent from second proposition that they do not realize that Rio, that Brazil, that these countries where the Olympics and other events fail is not entirely their fault. They are just a puppet of an ultimate and unaccountable and an internationally abusive Olympics. They have never given us any rebuttal to our reasons why the Olympics structurally discriminates against countries and forces them into situations they cannot escape. Which is why we are proud to say it is illegitimate to place the burden of international political failures on Brazil. What's the first question of today? Today's debate, the first principal question was about legitimacy. Okay? They told us that Brazil should have known 8 years in the future that it was going to suffer. They told you that Brazil should have known that it was going to get the Zika virus eventually. Brazil should have known that they're going to go into an economic recession right before the Olympics. No, they didn't. At that time, Brazil was basically one of the perfect bids possible. They couldn't have seen Zika coming. They couldn't have seen all of these obstacles coming. And that's a risk that countries take when they take in bids 8 years in advance. A lot can happen in 8 years, right? Now, the thing is that this is different from some of their examples of Qatar and Russia. This is a country that was not abusing its human rights violation. It was not extremely worse off. Like we showed you from first speech, it was a well-developing country and things went wrong. And this is where they failed to realize the truth. The problem isn't just in the bidding process. Because all they've really told us about reforms in the Olympics is, oh, we'll reform the countries to which the Olympic gives it to. False. Whose fault is it? Is the question that we ask under our legitimacy. Okay, they told you that Olympics is also taking the blame in a little bit. They're taking the blame that they failed to assess the situation and give it to the right people. Firstly, that's not really taking the blame. That's just saying that, sorry, bad, my bad. I gave it to a person who is going to abuse his own people. No, there are several problems with the Olympics that we illustrated to you. The fact that they force their countries to maintain a very strict, to have stadiums all around the place. The useless stadiums that they told you on their side of the house are mandated by sports organizations. Okay, the country that's actually organizing these events rarely has a choice in most of this. The planning is done by the Olympics. The Olympics wants to be extravagant. The Olympics wants to force these countries into their timeline. They have not rebutted that a single time in their entire speech. The fault is with the Olympics, and they failed to tell you that. Okay? Now, on third proposition, they tell us that they're going to fundamentally share the blame. Why? Why, we ask you, when the Olympics has every reason to shift the blame onto a country which everyone is now seeing as the problem, right? When they don't see Olympics as a problem, but they see Brazil's Olympics as a problem, that's when they lack any change, okay? Our first speaker showed you structural problems that they didn't defend. And then they told you that there's going to be pressure. And this is direct from the third speaker, okay? He told you that it's their fault that Brazil didn't fight pressure from the international society. Firstly, they're considering that a massive amount of pressure exists, right? That they were buckled by the pressure of the international society, that they were subject to media shaming if they weren't going to keep their deadlines, that they were going to suffer a loss of reputation if they didn't do so. This is critically harmful for a country that depends on international investors like Brazil does. Okay, it's extremely harmful for those countries, and it's not something which Brazil can easily fight against. Okay, we feel they contradicted themselves and helped our case when they conceded that such massive pressure exists. Now let's look at the second question of today's debate. Which side actually helps the people on the ground? Firstly, let's just address this amazingly offensive statement which they told us. We acknowledge that by boycotting Brazil, we might harm a few people. But considering the fact that local people on Brazil have already been abused, they've already been harmed, it's okay. It's okay if we damn them. We might have a small chance of helping a few people in Olympics in the future. Nonsense. Okay, we don't agree with damning these Brazilian people to hell. Now, I'll talk to you on how these people are going to benefit now. They've told you on how it harms the elite. Okay, firstly, this boycott does harm the elite in minimal fashion. Why? Because they've already gained from what they have to gain. They've gained from construction, they've gained from arranging this Olympics, they've gained from building roads and contracts with the government. Whoever is left to gain now, when the Olympics actually goes on, is mainly the country as a whole, and the people in the country. They gain through the massive image which they have, and we believe it's a good thing if Brazil actually manages to maintain its image and get investors so its people don't starve. The people over there on the ground gain from tourism, they gain from actually being seen on Twitter and media. Things like this is what actually brings them true visibility, which actually brings true change on our side of the house. Okay, the poor people, the local people are the ones who gain in the last phase of the Olympics. Okay. Now, they told you that we're creating deterrence, okay? This is a lie on their side. There's a month left for the Olympics. They cannot make deterrence. They cannot get out of recession. What we've shown to you is that basically just on outcomes, we better the lives of the people in Brazil. Because we give them a chance to earn from the Olympics that's going to happen. They've already suffered. I'll take a break.
The world has been trying for decades after decades to overcome the structural barriers to reform. Give us one good reason why in your world any of these reforms are likely to materialize.
FIFA's example. So you told, that brings me actually very conveniently onto my third point. Okay, third point on long-term change. Now, you yourself told us, sir, that the World Cup was a failure and that no change happened because of that. Now, let me ask you, did Sepp Blatter get arrested before or after? Did he get arrested during the World Cup scandal? Yes, he did. The fact is that the massive visibility caused by the problems of the Rio World Cup, caused by the problems of other World Cup assignments, is what brought down the head of FIFA, the corrupt head of FIFA. It has a very positive influence. The same thing is very likely to have on Olympics, because what happens on our side of the house? What do? We acknowledge the blame on the actual right actor. We shift media attention to them. No longer are people blaming Brazil, but Brazil and other countries which know this pain are blaming the Olympics. Structural problems are revealed. Okay? Now, they told you that on their side of the house, this boycott is going to be universal. No. Because the entire second speaker was talking about how everyone faces losses. The sports team faces losses, local people faces losses, all countries face losses. They've only given us reasons why people aren't going to really boycott this event. Okay, and as a result, we don't think they actually can claim to achieve a unified boycott on their side of the house. Okay, at the end of the day, it's imperative what both teams have showed you. We've showed you how it's principally unjust to blame Brazil for all of these problems. Because for blame Brazil for all of these problems? Because Brazil has been strong-armed into these. We've also shown you that when you boycott this, you are harming the people on the ground. The elite are not going to suffer if you don't hold the Olympics. They've already gained. It is the locals who are going to suffer even more politically and monetarily. Okay, and at the end of the day, we've shown you that everyone faces losses. The Olympic Committee is not going to change when you don't focus on them. When the media focus on Rio instead of them. At the end of the day, we create change. We recognize it is illegitimate to place the burden of the international political failures on Brazil. We are the ones who foster real change, both side opposition.
I've actually got a better structure now.
But be careful about your math.
Awesome.
So,
So for Optifly, I invite Karthik.
Yeah.
there. Let's take a walk through the world of side proposition. Let's take a walk through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, actually. There are several problems there, problems that they elaborated on quite cogently. There are people rioting in the streets. There are people who complain that the stadiums are not being used to generate any revenue from them. There are people who say, where's all the benefits that we were promised? The Rio Olympics was supposed to be held here. Why aren't we getting any revenue? And we asked them, why are you doing this? What did we hear from them? We heard it's Brazil's fault. They were complicit in all the bad problems happening in Brazil. Therefore, we need to punish them. To which we said, wait, no, but it's actually the International Olympic Committee's fault for all the reasons that we told you, like punitive fines, like the deadlines that they impose on Brazil, like the incredibly terrible oversight that they have on Brazil during construction of stadiums, like the rules that say you have to have stadiums here, there, and everywhere. To all these things, what did they tell us? They said, we blame the IOC too. And what do we hear from them as to how they blame the IOC? They said that the IOC says that we a bit fault for giving it to the wrong actor. We told you that, but that's not the fault that they have. The fault that they have is in the rules they set. To which we heard absolutely no response. We also said, wait, no, but it's still not fair because they couldn't have predicted it. They couldn't have predicted all the problems that would happen from Rio. They couldn't have predicted the Zika virus, for example. They couldn't have predicted the fact that there would be a political crisis in Brazil. They couldn't have predicted the fact that there would be a financial crisis in 2008 and that there would be a recession in Brazil going on to this very day. What did we hear in response to that? Nothing. We didn't hear any reason from them as to why the fact that so much of this was due to unpredictable chance that they couldn't control is a reason for it to be fair to boycott Rio. What else did we hear from them on the fairness of the issue? They said we were happy to boycott Russia World Cup and Qatar World Cup as well. Did we ask them why? Why is that fair? Do you ultimately want it to be in only Western countries where you have absolutely, like, the only Olympics can be held in Western capitals? Is this fair? And we didn't hear any response from them on that as well. Finally, we asked them, will this even benefit Brazil? And they said yes. And we asked them, why would it benefit Brazil? From that, we heard it's the elites who are going to lose out. No, but before that, we heard all the reasons why it wouldn't help Brazil. We heard all the reasons why the people are going to suffer from this, reasons that we thought that we would have to contest them on. We thought that we would have to tell them that all the problems are being faced by people of Brazil, but they had clearly admitted it to it in their second speech, when they said that this is going to harm all these actors. What was their justification for this, we asked them. The only response they said was deterrence. Deterrence for what? Given that Brazil is going to host the Olympics in a month, you clearly cannot stop Brazil from doing something in the future. It's unlikely to ever host a sports event in the near future. So clearly you can't be deterring Brazil. Who else could you be deterring? You could also be deterring Qatar or Russia, for example. But then why award the contracts to them in the first place? And also, why is it just to punish the people of Rio, to punish the people of Brazil just in the name of deterrence? Particularly given the analysis we gave you on why the people who benefit from this are the elites. The late phase, early phase gap that Opco told you about, and how the people who suffer are the common people of Rio. We told you that there's going to be the people who benefit in the run-up to the Olympics are the people who are poor and living on the streets and who live and who are street vendors and so on, to the people who will come as tourists. Those are the people who are going to lose from this. The elites are not going to lose from this, is what Oppo told you, because of the fact that all the gain they had is already gotten from the contracts, from building roads, from building stadiums. Given this, who exactly are you deterring to begin with? What else did we tell you on the harms to show that we should win this debate? We showed you that's going to cause a great political crisis. Analysis that they completely dropped. They didn't tell us why it's justified to cause political crisis. They didn't also tell us why it's justified to risk the careers of athletes and sportspersons across the world just in the name of a political statement. For all these reasons, I beg you to stand with opposition.
So now for the last speech of the debate, I invite Varish for the Gov reply. Hear him.
All that is required for evil to persist in this world is for good men to stand by and do nothing. That is precisely what Team Opposition does in today's debate. First, let's take them up on their kind offer and go for a walk through the streets of Rio de Janeiro. Here's what the difference is between our side and their side. We recognize that there is a great moral harm happening in front of us. There is an immense harm you're doing to the poor people in the country who live below the poverty line, who live in absolute misery, and you simply play the blame game. You say it wasn't their fault, it wasn't this person's fault, it wasn't Brazil's fault. That's all that person does on this walk. What do? We recognize our moral duty. We recognize that we can't just stand by and do nothing when that person suffers in front of us on a day-to-day basis and he has no means of helping himself, and we're the only ones in the position to do so, as we have pointed out to you. On our side, there is an immense suffering that we recognize, and we're not afraid to do something about it. Second, they fail to understand what we even mean by a boycott in the first place. They seem to think it's some sort of blame game, but it's not. It means that you do not stand for, you do not condone, and you do not support a great injustice that you are in a position to make a stance on. What do they do from their side? And why do we show on a first basis of winning this debate, why are we on a moral high ground? They deny the problem, first of all, which is utterly offensive to each and every one of the people who are living that reality on a day-to-day basis. They would like you to believe that 8 years ago, Brazil was a perfect bid. I repeat that, ladies and gentlemen. They claim that Brazil would be a perfect bid 8 years ago, completely ignoring the fact that even 8 years ago, even more than 8 years ago, Brazil had thousands and thousands of favelas. It had huge amounts of people living below any reasonable standard of what a human dignified life even needs. This is an immense moral harm. This immensely reduces any claim that they have to being any sort of legitimacy under our criteria of being able to host that in the proper sense that we have clearly showed to you must stand in the first place. On a secondary note, they're inconsistent in whether they choose to regard this blame as important. Because understand why that blame doesn't even matter in the first place. What matters is that the poor deserve help. What matters is there's no way for these people to get the help that they deserve without doing so. Why do they lose the moral ground even more completely and make it clear for us why we win this debate, regardless of practical benefits? Because in their world, they do nothing. In their world, what the alternative they want is simple condemnation of the Olympic Committee. Condemnation is all they have to offer, a few strongly worded letters. What does this mean? This means that people on the ground are being demolished of their homes and mass arrests in Brazil still continue on a day-to-day basis. The problem is not at all solved under their world. Why do we mean to win this debate on an even secondary basis of having more effective reform? Because that's a common ground we were able to reach. We do both want reform, but on their side, they have simple condemnation. It doesn't work. The sponsors, the tourists, the ticket sales, all these things still flow in, and they still support a decision that this was the right thing to do. Why will simply blaming the committee not work? Because it won't make that president step down. As long as that president can show them that, look, I'm doing my job, I'm keeping the money flowing, I'm keeping this event running, no reform happens. Condemnation is not something new. Condemnation is the status quo. We already know of the degree of corruption that happens in these institutions, but it hasn't worked. Condemning hasn't worked. On our side, we show you that before making a decision, the state does want to host, which obviously because it means so much to them, they will ensure fairer conditions for the people who need it the most. They will stop the mass arresting if they want any chance of being able to hold that event in the first place. Because understand that reform doesn't work because those people doesn't want it to work. We force it and we make sure we do something with the immense moral harm that those people simply do not do so. We win this debate on both principle and practical grounds. We're very proud of principles.
Okay. So thank you everyone for watching the debate from wherever you were. So that concludes the debate officially.